SoundCartel.
In this episode, Omny Studios Managing Director Sharon Taylor looks back both on podcasting trends of 2020 as well as forward to what lies ahead. She also explains secure distribution and helps us all better understand and analyse those all-important podcast analytics.
Build an audience on your own patch of land. Like we have some clients that get up to 30% of their listening on their owned and operated websites. That's amazing. That's a huge section of data that you can draw inferences from.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nick Schildberger, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 16 of season 4. And joining me once more is producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hi, Nick. How are you? So good to be back again.
Now, Nicole, the US election will be in progress right around the time this episode is dropping, and I know that you are slightly obsessed.
A little.
So I thought you might like to quickly look at how Trump and Biden have used podcasts as part of their campaigns.
Yes, I'm rocking in the corner, Nick. I'm at peak anxiety. But interestingly, both campaigns came out with a podcast. I don't think which were particularly long running. However, what's more interesting is ad placement within other podcasts and genres. So the Trump campaign came out hard with a lot of advertising in July, and they've kind of petered off. But for those observant listeners, that's probably got a lot to do with the campaign finance running out, but that's a whole other story. And converse to that, Biden is coming in stronger towards the latter end of the campaign. Biden, interestingly, that campaign is running ads in the more comedic and news style podcasts, and Trump very much in the news and culture podcasts. So
He doesn't have a lot of humour in his approach to life, does he?
And yet he does some very funny things. But I think there are a lot of people trying to placate their fears and their concerns by watching and listening to comedy podcasts, trying to get some levity in what is an extremely stressful time. So it makes sense. There probably aren't that many comedic Republican podcasts, which is why Trump's not advertising in them. But the strategies are quite different, and we'll see what works.
Yes, it'll be interesting to see, and also I'm sure you are waiting with bated breath to see who wins the election. But we must move on. Another topic that is very close to your heart, Nicole, is host-read ads. And Nielsen has just released some research on this very topic.
Indeed, very interesting. And we bang on about this all the time, Nick, that the data does bear out consistently that host-read ads do outperform non-host-read ads. So, for example, in this new tranche of research from Nielsen, brand recall for host-read ads sits at 71%, whereas it's at 62% for non-host read ads.
Still pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, it really does show that ads in general are effective. Now we're just talking about incrementally so. There are some other interesting stats, particularly in all of the 5 brand lift metrics that they measured, which were familiarity, affinity, info-seek intent, which is more around finding out more information about the brand, purchase intent and recommendation intent. The increase in stats for host-read versus non-host-read ranged between 33% and 67% more.
Okay, you've convinced me. It's host-read all the way.
Excellent.
But let's get to my chat with Sharon Taylor now. She's the managing director of podcast hosting platform Omny Studio and a good friend of this podcast. We talk trends, private podcasts, and Sharon helps us all better understand how to best analyse podcast analytics. Welcome back to Podcasting Essentials, Sharon.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Now, the last time we spoke was all the way back in March, which was still relatively early days for COVID.
That seems so long ago now.
I know.
Time has no meaning this year.
Back then, you expected audio listening habits to alter because of things like commute times evaporating, and perhaps smart speaker listening might increase because we're going to be around the house more. So 6 months on, what have you observed?
We saw, obviously, like everyone, I think, in our position around the world, a dip in all audio consumption really briefly, and especially in audio advertising as people had a bit of uncertainty in the market. What's really interesting when we looked at before COVID kind of early to mid of COVID and now what we would call our latter stages of COVID is to see where the listening shifted. So we saw a drop in early morning listening, but actually now we're seeing a higher amount of mid-morning listening than before COVID. So listening habits have really changed. We're seeing a greater uptick of listening from 4 p.m. onwards. So there might not be a commute anymore, but maybe people are trying to mimic that. I think people have found the time in the day where they're going to carve out for their new habits, right?
And do you think it's not only new habits but new listeners that have found podcasting during the pandemic?
Yeah, potentially. It would be interesting to dig into that. Like I know Edison Research has done some research around the podcast consumer during COVID, and they actually saw that the average consumer is listening to more audio content, but I don't think that they went into new versus returning listeners. But I mean, it was such an unusual time. Like Nielsen came out with research actually that said that people were going to consume 60% more content during COVID, and you'd have to assume that some of that is podcasting, especially with the new types of content that came out. Like you had every man and his dog create a coronavirus daily podcast, and a 5-minute news podcast is a lot of information to get on a daily basis about this topic that was consuming our lives and still does.
A friend of mine is a member of a sailing club, and that sailing club obviously couldn't have anyone sailing and doing anything during lockdown, so they started a podcast, and that person, I presume quite a few members, probably never listened to a podcast, but because they were sent a podcast by their sailing club, they may have tuned in for the first time.
Yeah, we had heaps of businesses do the same thing at Omny. So I think the NGV, Gymnastics Victoria, like a whole pile of organisations that were no longer communicating with their members or their patrons day in and day out and needed to find a different way of getting content to them and information to them. So yeah, it's been a great time, I think, for audio. The one thing that has been proven out of COVID is that audio is a resilient medium and the bottom didn't fall out. Hooray, everybody. Like, we're still in business.
Pandemic proof, as they say.
Yeah, touch wood.
Now, also last time, I challenged you with a crystal ball. Pretty difficult in 2020 to predict anything, but nevertheless, let's go back and revisit a few of those items. First, you hope that podcast listenership would increase to 70 to 75% of the population. Perhaps a touch ambitious, but that's okay. We like that. Are we on track, do you think, to see that level of significant growth throughout this year into next year?
I still think so. And I will claim the 75% still. Podcast awareness in the US in the Share of Ear report by Edison Research that got released recently, 75% of Americans are familiar with the term podcasting now, which is great. So I'll claim the 75%. Thanks.
You can have it. You also predicted that we might see new types and styles of audio content being produced, mainly to better meet the new listener habits that we just talked about, as well as matching some other opportunities being created by the likes of Spotify.
Yeah, so I think that we did see an uptick of daily news and current affairs shows. More people created them. In the latter stages of the pandemic, we saw people maybe moving away from those and more content like comedy getting created and consumed because people wanted a break from that kind of stuff. Spotify is really interesting. They'd launched their Daily Drive product at the start or just near the start of the pandemic, and there's new content. Like in Australia, Podshape has created a new daily morning show replicating kind of breakfast radio, but specifically for the podcasting community or the podcasting ecosystem. And I think that's fantastic. I think we are going to keep seeing new styles come out and testing the waters.
Well, I noticed as a judge of the Australian Podcast Awards this year that there were more shows that were of a radio style, but not just radio on demand, but actually being created for podcasts first, which I really enjoyed listening to.
Yes, yeah.
Now, moving on to brands. For those that are still sitting on the fence when it comes to creating their own podcasts, is it worth the effort?
Yes, I'll always say yes, definitively yes. It's such an emerging and exciting medium still, even though it's been growing rapidly for like the last few years, and even just in the last couple of years that you and I have been talking. There is now an even more captive audience craving communication and a connection, and you can create that for your customers or your staff or whoever you're going to create that for. Why wouldn't you? When, especially through the pandemic, we've seen that consumption is only increasing. So yeah, get on board.
So what have you seen lately that's working really well for brands? Have you got some examples?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come to mind. Macmillan, the book publisher in the US, did a really interesting thing where they teamed up with Apple to promote the movie The Green Book, which was a book first, I would assume. And they did like a driving podcast. And so as you follow the journey the Green Book took presumably on a road trip, you would get different pieces of content, and they promoted that in a really smart way. And I thought that was a great way of a brand, which is a book publisher, getting into podcasting as a companion medium. Thought that was really cool. Rogers, which is a big telco in Canada, did an amazing thing with Pacific Content about what started out as a plan for an internal podcast, actually. It's called For the Love of Work, and they realised that the messages that they were going to get out just for the staff, of which they've got, I think there's over 20,000 employees in the organisation, they realised that the messages and the content they were building could be consumed by a much wider audience, and so they actually launched it as a public-facing podcast, and it's been really popular.
Handy to be able to launch to 20,000 people internally before you even worry about your external market.
Correct, yeah. I mean, you've got a captive audience as an internal podcast, so promote to them, see what they like, see what they don't like, and let that guide your external marketing strategies.
That's a nice segue into my next question, which is about private and internal podcasts. You couldn't do any overseas travel this year for your speaking engagements that you usually do, but you kept the team very busy at Omny Studio, developing some new software around secure distribution, which makes it much easier for businesses now to distribute their podcasts privately. Can you explain how it all works and some of the benefits?
So when you think about podcasting normally, how often have we heard find this show wherever you get your podcasts? So RSS feeds, podcasting has been built for public consumption. You can distribute it anywhere. What we're seeing is this increasing appetite for both internal podcasts and restricted access for like either a members only feed, maybe you've got like some bonus content you want to give away to paying subscribers so that you can have an individual feed per member, so that those members can't then share those feeds around. And so it is really quite personalised specifically for that person that is either accessing it through the standard podcasting app of their choice or maybe via a login to your website so that you can actually make it like an internal staff podcast on an intranet. We built all that works with the existing podcast apps or infrastructure that a company already has.
What I really like about it is that ability for it to work with existing podcast apps. In the old days, if I wanted to subscribe to a premium podcast that I was paying for, I would have to be sent an RSS feed and type it into Apple Podcasts, and it was a real pain. So what you're saying is now you can send a user a link which automatically subscribes in Apple Podcasts. It appears in their feed like a normal public podcast, but it's not actually available to the public. It's only going to be viewed by that person.
Correct, yeah. So you would have a membership database. You integrate that with Omny Studio so that we create a unique feed for each of those staff members or listeners. We send that back out. You can mail merge each of those links into like a MailChimp email, send it out, communicate with those stakeholders however you like. And then when they get that, they just tap a link on their phone. It automatically opens up a page that gives them all the choices of where to listen to it, and then they're off.
So for businesses that want to communicate with their staff with private and confidential information, it's a very secure way of doing it.
Correct.
And if someone leaves, you can just revoke their access.
Yep, remove the token and then that's it. That member's gone.
And for other creators that are targeting not their own staff, but perhaps they're producing a public-facing podcast but want to have additional features that you pay for, rather than having to create the Wondery Plus app, you can effectively use this service, can you?
Correct.
It's a way of using a paywall to monetize a podcast.
Sounds like maybe the SoundCartel employees are going to get an internal podcast soon. I would, feel free. Yes.
Now, I'd like to move on to the exciting topic of podcast analytics. Clients often ask us why hosting platform, so like Omny Studio analytics, don't match up with those provided by the likes of Apple and Spotify. So can you tell me in simple terms why this is and who should we trust when reporting those all-important user stats?
Sure. Think about Apple and Spotify and all those apps as one slice of your downloads. So your podcast host, like Omny Studio or whoever else you use, is pulling in all of the downloads that are happening across websites, podcast apps, wherever people can access your show. And we then crunch the numbers, we filter out anything that we think as erroneous downloads, we all hopefully are certified by the IAB that has come out with a set of guidelines as to what counts as a download, quote unquote. And so the short answer is that you should trust your host's analytics. If you don't trust your host analytics, then...
change host.
Well, yeah, your words, not mine. But you need to have a point of truth, and that is the hosting platform, because at least you know that the numbers you see in there from Spotify, from Apple, from Pocket Cast, from all these places have been filtered and crunched in the same way. Whereas when you look at Apple and Spotify separately, what they're showing you could be different for a number of reasons, whether their own filtering methodology is different. Spotify has a notion of a listener to a show versus like a download in their nomenclature. Apple, when they're showing you the downloads from their system, it's based on users that have opted in to send that data back to Apple, and there's a whole pile of other caveats and things there. So they'll always be close, but those minutiae of differences in how people filter, you'll drive yourself crazy if you're always hunting down. But Omny said it was 200 downloads and Apple said it was 198.
I think if it's close like that, people don't get too concerned. I think it's when you see quite a large discrepancy. The Apple opt-in thing is interesting. I think that would explain a lot of why Apple's numbers sometimes will be lower.
Mm-hmm.
I also believe Apple don't necessarily report on older versions of iOS as well.
Correct. You'd think that everyone was on the most, maybe not the most up-to-date, but the iOS versions that they do. I mean, the other complexity in looking at downloads is a concept of user agents. And so when you look in your hosting provider's analytics, you know Spotify sends a specific user agent, and so that's why we can say Spotify downloads are X. Because of the way podcasting was birthed into the world, mostly through Apple, a lot of third-party apps still have Apple's user agent. And so we're dealing with a couple at the moment where they haven't named their app in a way that signifies that it's not iOS podcast.
So basically what you're saying is Omny is going to report higher numbers of Apple downloads because that's actually capturing other apps as well, whereas Apple will only report real Apple downloads.
It's data in, data out, right? So if your host is shown data that says it's an iOS podcast app, then we report it that way. Whereas Apple, Spotify, they are their own ecosystems, and so they know what is happening in there to a greater extent probably than a third party.
I always say to clients that ask the question, trust your host like you did. But it's interesting sometimes to go into Spotify, for example, because they can provide some demographic information about their users that the host will probably never be able to report.
That's true.
Never say never.
Never say never. But what apps have as an advantage is that they control the listener, they control the player. And so if you have to sign in to access Spotify, I mean, technically Spotify think I'm a 68-year-old male because I don't want ads targeted to me. Like, I guess, I don't know why, I'd rather have male 68-year-old ads, but it's, again, data in, data out. So Apple don't have that. Your Apple ID, I don't believe, crosses the threshold into the Apple Podcasts team, whereas Spotify know that Sharon Taylor is logged in and listening. And when you control that environment, you can do a lot more with analytics, advertising, and all kinds of things.
Now, before our listeners' eyes glaze over, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. What's the difference between a download, a listen, and a stream?
All of podcasting is downloads. Let's just get that out of the way first. And then there is a more technical term, which is progressive downloads. It mimics streaming behaviour. So click to play, you see the file buffering, and you would think that that's streaming because you're used to that with music and Spotify. But everything through RSS is delivered via a download. Spotify are doing things a little bit differently because, again, they control that player, so it actually is streaming ad technology. And that's why they can say it's a listen. So in most podcasting circles, a download is sometimes conflated and called a listen because it's as close to you can get, knowing that we all filter to the same rigorous standards, that you think a download actually has a human at the end of it, and so that human is listening. You know, in Omny Studio, we've got a download count, and then if you have consumption analytics enabled and if you're getting a decent amount of traffic to like a web player or your own app that has got that API into it, then again, because we control the player, we know that it's a listen, and so that's when we start calling it a listen.
Yeah, you just touched on consumption data, and that's obviously, if you can get it, is much more valuable because you can then see exactly how far someone listened through the episode, which you can't get from a download because the full podcast episode is going to be downloaded. If it's an embedded audio player from your host, then you should be able to get consumption data.
Correct.
Are there other ways?
You can piece it together. So Apple do have their own consumption tracking, again, with all the caveats that we mentioned before. So like a slice of listens that are coming through Apple. You could build your own app and integrate an API or some technical way of getting that consumption data back out. And those are really the only two ways that you can do it. You've got to control the player.
Which is why we've said many times on this podcast, drive traffic wherever you can back to your website.
Oh, yeah. Build an audience on your own patch of land. Like we have some clients that get up to 30% of their listening on their owned and operated websites. That's amazing. That's a huge section of data that you can draw inferences from.
So final question on this. When we're trying to measure engagement with our podcasts, what's the best way to do that right now with the tools and analytics that we have?
The question back to you is, what are you trying to get out of your podcast? If you're trying to sell advertising, then the best metric is going to be downloads or ad impressions. If you're a brand that is looking for engagement, then you have your own set of KPIs. And maybe web traffic is that measurement. Maybe you're only getting a couple of hundred downloads a month, but it's of a very engaged audience, and that you've seen purchases on your website go up or memberships go up as a byproduct of it. So I think it's different for everyone. 90% of people are looking at their downloads at their hosting platform, last 30 days, and then tracking the growth month on month.
Spotify, they've invested heavily in podcasting in the last 18 months. Quite a different strategy to that of Apple, who are keeping podcasts quite separate to their music in separate apps, whereas Spotify is doing the complete opposite, which means they have a huge listenership all in the one place. Now, Spotify's VP of Consumer Experience, Sten Garmick, recently announced some new plans for Spotify. What does that mean for podcast creators and indeed listeners?
Yeah, I think Spotify are taking an approach of building out a wider tool set for creators so that they can entice more people into their platform, both listeners and also shows, because it's a volume game for Spotify. The more podcast content they've got on their platform, it's not a direct correlation, but the less music royalties or the less profits are eaten into by music royalties, right? But I think they're also doing really interesting things, marrying spoken word and music. So they launched the ability for podcasts created in their system to integrate with a music library. So you could do like talk, song, which is an interesting concept and, dare I say, a game changer. If there's a market for people out there that want to mimic the radio experience with podcasting content, I think that's amazing. So Spotify are definitely testing a lot of different things.
Well, to finish, it's crystal ball time again. What trends are we going to see in 2021 and where are the biggest opportunities for brands?
Maybe I'll double down again. 95% of podcast listening.
Oh, that'd be good.
That'd be amazing. No, I think, look, all the normal, really banal stuff like podcast listening is going to increase, awareness is going to increase, more brands, more players, everyone's going to get into the space. I think that we're going to continue seeing those content wars, like Amazon, Spotify, Apple, Google, and a host of others that I think and know about to get into the space. There's going to be huge money flying around town, more Kevin Hart's getting money thrown at them to do podcasts, bigger network moves. So I think that consolidation and kind of collapsing in a lot of other ways hasn't near finished. So watch out for more of that. Advertising, I think we're going to see more personalisation in podcast advertising, especially as Spotify gets a larger audience. Spotify is a beast that knows if your phone's out of your pocket versus in your pocket, and they're not going to capitalise on that for advertising. But at the same time, I think we're going to see a bigger uptake on contextual advertising, so more people transcribing content and trying to find an advertiser based on the actual sentiment of their content as opposed to just like selling a pre, mid or post roll. And I'd like to think that we're going to see new content styles still. I think there's going to be a bigger groundswell towards people supporting the podcast of their choice. And so maybe less advertising and more pay us $5 and get ad-free versions of your shows. More marrying of non-audio content makers getting into the audio space and thinking about how they might tie paywalling of their news content with an audio component, for instance. But mostly the 95% of listening. I'm going to double down on that. Hold me to it this time next year.
Oh, I will. And I very much look forward to discussing it all with you next year. Thank you very much, Sharon, for joining us on Podcasting Essentials.
Thank you for having me.
Geez, you've got to love an update from Sharon. She is so good.
So passionate about the industry, which is great.
Yeah, loves it. Particularly what I liked was her referencing the really great brand examples that are out there and the new ways that they're getting on board. For instance, I really like the telco brand from Canada, Rogers, how they teamed with Pacific Content to start what was an internal podcast only and then branched out to a public-facing podcast because the content was so good.
And internal podcasts we've seen more of this year. In fact, Sharon mentioned Gymnastics Victoria, which happens to be one that we're producing here at SoundCartel.
Yeah, and I think internal podcasts are a great gateway for brands too. So if you're wanting to dip your toe in the podcast water, certainly try an internal podcast, especially when you consider a platform like Omny, who's got secure distribution of their private and internal podcasts. It's safe and a great way to move forward.
Yeah, sometimes what you think's only interesting to your staff, if it's not of a confidential nature, might actually have some broader appeal. So why not get it out there?
Exactly.
And I'm sure, like me, you're very keen to see if Sharon's prediction of huge listenership in the next few months comes to fruition.
Oh, big call, but yeah, chomping at the bit to see. I'll put money on it.
That's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me as always.
No worries, Nick. Always happy to be here.
To find out more about how we can help you create a podcast, check out our website at soundcartel.com.au or on the socials at SoundCartelAU. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're after business insights and inspiration each morning, check out our daily podcast, Business Essentials Daily, wherever you're listening now. From all of us at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.